Most Americans think they know when World War II began. They picture December 7, 1941, a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, the drone of engines over Pearl Harbor, battleships in flames, and a country that had been watching from a safe distance suddenly forced into a war it didn't start. It's a clean story with a clear beginning, and for the United States, it's not even wrong. But here's the problem. By the time that first bomb fell on Battleship Row, the war had already been raging in Europe for more than 2 years, and in Asia for over 4. And the war itself, the actual reason tens of millions of people were already dead before America ever entered it, didn't begin with a surprise attack or a madman's ideology arriving out of nowhere. It began with a banker who believed printing more money could never cause a problem, as long as the economy seemed to want it. Let me say that again, because it matters. The popular version of this story starts with Adolf Hitler's rise and treats it almost like a force of nature, a uniquely evil man who appeared and seized a nation through sheer will and propaganda. That version isn't false, exactly. It's just missing the mechanism. It skips over the specific, traceable, almost boringly bureaucratic sequence of financial decisions that turned a defeated but functioning democracy into a nation desperate enough to hand its future to an extremist. What actually happened is a story about currency, about a central bank that refused to stop the presses, about American loans that propped up a fragile peace for 5 years, and about exactly what happened, second by second, when that money was suddenly pulled away. So let's go back, not to 1939, and not even to 1933, but to an office in Berlin in the early 1920s, where the true origin of World War II starts with a decision about how much paper money to print. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations on Germany, totaling 132 billion gold marks, a sum many economists at the time, including John Maynard Keynes, warned was simply impossible to collect without destroying the German economy in the process. Germany had lost the war, lost territory, lost its colonies, and now owed an amount of money that dwarfed anything it could realistically produce. The German government faced an impossible choice. It could try to raise that money through brutal taxation that would crush its own population, or it could do something that seemed, in the moment, less painful: print the money instead. The man in charge of that decision was Rudolf Havenstein, president of Germany's central bank, the Reichsbank, since 1908. Havenstein held an economic belief that sounds almost quaint today, but that had catastrophic consequences at the time. He believed the central bank's job was simply to supply whatever amount of currency the economy seemed to demand. If prices were rising, in his view, that meant more currency was needed to keep transactions flowing, not less. He treated inflation as a symptom of external pressure on Germany, never as a consequence of his own printing presses. So the Reichsbank kept printing and printing. As France occupied Germany's industrial Ruhr region in 1923 in an attempt to physically seize reparations payments, and German workers responded with a general strike that the government funded by printing still more money to pay their wages, the cycle spiraled completely out of control. By August 1923, with prices rising 20-fold in a single month, Havenstein was still insisting publicly that the inflation came from abroad and that the Reichsbank was simply meeting demand. That same month, he reported to Germany's Council of State that the bank was issuing 20,000 billion marks in new currency daily, and that within a week, that figure would rise to 46,000 billion marks a day. And he presented this not as a warning, but as an accomplishment. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. Life savings that had taken a lifetime to build were wiped out in weeks. Pensioners watched their retirement funds become worthless enough to be used as kindling. There are widely documented photographs from this period of German children stacking bundles of banknotes like building blocks, and of housewives using wheelbarrows just to carry enough cash to buy a loaf of bread. This wasn't hardship. This was the complete collapse of an entire population's ability to trust money itself. And here's the detail that almost never makes it into the popular telling. Rudolf Havenstein died of a heart attack on November 20th, 1923, the exact same day the German currency was finally stabilized under his successor, Hjalmar Schacht. It's a genuinely strange historical coincidence. The man who oversaw the collapse died the very day it ended. replaced by someone willing to actually stop the printing presses. With a new currency, the Rentenmark, stabilized and shocked, cutting off the unlimited printing, Germany desperately needed a way to actually manage its reparations burden without repeating the disaster. In 1924, an American banker named Charles Dawes, who would later become Vice President of the United States, led an international committee that produced what became known as the Dawes Plan. It restructured German reparations onto a more realistic sliding scale, reorganized the Reichsbank under Allied oversight, and, most importantly, arranged for American banks to loan Germany roughly 800 million gold marks to rebuild its industrial base. It worked, at least on the surface. German industrial output roughly doubled between 1923 and 1928. Unemployment fell. Berlin became a cultural capital of Europe. Historians often call the years from 1924 to 1929 Germany's golden years. But underneath that recovery sat a fragility almost nobody wanted to look at directly. Germany's entire economic stability now depended on a continuous flow of American capital that could, in theory, be withdrawn at any time. Even during the best years of this recovery, unemployment never fully disappeared. 1.3 million Germans were still out of work in 1928, in the supposed peak of the golden years. The foundation looked solid. It was actually standing on borrowed time, financed by loans that assumed American prosperity would simply continue indefinitely. It didn't. In October 1929, the American stock market crashed, and the United States sank into the early stages of what would become the Great Depression. American banks, suddenly desperate for cash themselves, began calling in their overseas loans, including the loans keeping the German economy afloat. The pipeline that had funded Germany's recovery for 5 years didn't just slow down, it essentially stopped. German unemployment, which had been around 1.3 million during the supposed good years, exploded. By 1932, roughly 6 million Germans were out of work, nearly a third of the entire workforce. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and an entire generation of Germans who had already lived through the trauma of the 1923 hyperinflation, who had already watched their parents' life savings become worthless paper once before, now watched the fragile recovery that followed collapse for a second time in less than a decade. This is the part that historians who focus purely on ideology tend to underweight. It wasn't that the German public suddenly discovered fascist ideas in 1930 that hadn't existed in 1928. The ideas had been there the whole time. Hitler had already attempted and failed at a coup in 1923, the same year as the hyperinflation crisis, and spent over a year in prison for it, where he wrote Mein Kampf. What changed between 1928 and 1932 wasn't the ideology. It was the audience's desperation. The numbers here are almost too clean, in a grim way, not to notice. In the May 1928 federal election, during the tail end of the golden years, while unemployment was still relatively low, the Nazi Party won just 2.6% of the national vote and 12 seats in the Reichstag. They were a fringe movement, regionally concentrated, taken seriously by almost nobody outside Bavaria. By September 1930, a full year into the post-crash collapse, with unemployment climbing rapidly, that number had jumped to 18.3% and 107 seats, an eightfold increase in support in just over 2 years. By July 1932, with unemployment near its peak at roughly 6 million Germans out of work, the Nazi Party had become the single largest party in the Reichstag, winning 37.3% of the vote and 230 seats. Their support dipped slightly to 33.1% that November, and for a brief moment, some observers believed the party had peaked and would begin to fade. It didn't get the chance to fade. What followed wasn't really a democratic triumph. It was a backroom political calculation by Germany's conservative elite. President Paul von Hindenburg, an aging war hero who personally distrusted Hitler, had refused for months to appoint him chancellor despite his party's electoral strength. But as one short-lived government after another failed to stabilize the country, conservative power brokers around Hindenburg, including former Chancellor Franz von Papen, convinced themselves they could bring Hitler into government and control him from the inside, using him as a figurehead while they held the real levers of power. On January 30, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Papen reportedly believed they had hired Hitler, not empowered him. Within weeks, that assumption proved catastrophically wrong. It's worth pausing here, because the popular version of this story often makes it sound like Germany's path to catastrophe was somehow unique to Germany. It wasn't. The same global economic collapse that devastated Germany was tearing through the rest of the industrialized world at the exact same time, and it produced strikingly similar political responses in more than one country. In Japan, the collapse of global trade and commodity prices hit the country's export-dependent economy hard, strengthening the hand of military leaders who argued that Japan needed to secure its own resources and markets through territorial expansion rather than trade. In September 1931, Japanese military forces engineered a pretext to invade Manchuria in northern China, establishing a puppet state and beginning a pattern of aggressive expansion that would continue through the decade and directly into full-scale war with China by 1937, years before Germany invaded Poland. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already seized power in 1922, well before the worst of the global economic collapse, but the Depression-era desperation of the 1930s strengthened his grip and emboldened his own imperial ambitions, including the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. This is the piece that gets lost when American audiences focus on Pearl Harbor as the story's starting point. World War II wasn't a single war that suddenly appeared in December 1941. It was the collision of at least three separate authoritarian expansion projects, German, Japanese, and Italian, each substantially fueled by the same global economic catastrophe, each convinced that military conquest was a rational response to economic desperation, and each already at war for years before the United States entered the fight. So what does the popular version of this story usually get wrong? It gets wrong the idea that Hitler's rise was primarily a story about ideology and propaganda succeeding against a healthy, functioning democracy. The ideology existed for a decade before it found a mass audience. What actually changed was the economic floor collapsing out from under an already traumatized population, twice, in less than 10 years, first through hyperinflation and then through mass unemployment, until tens of millions of ordinary Germans became willing to gamble on an extremist who promised to fix what democratic governments had twice failed to protect. It gets wrong the idea that this was primarily a European story, that America watched from a safe distance until Pearl Harbor. The economic engine that both stabilized and then destabilized Weimar Germany ran directly through American capital, Charles Dawes's loan program, and then the sudden American withdrawal of that capital after the 1929 crash. The United States wasn't a bystander to this chain of events. It was, unknowingly, one of the load-bearing walls in the structure that collapsed. And it gets wrong, perhaps most importantly, the idea that this was a single, sudden catastrophe rather than a chain of individually explicable decisions stretching back over a decade. A central banker who genuinely believed unlimited printing couldn't cause inflation. An American financier who genuinely believed loans could stabilize a fragile peace. A banking system that genuinely believed it needed to protect its own solvency in 1929, without fully reckoning with what pulling that capital back out of Germany would trigger. A conservative political establishment that genuinely believed it could control an extremist by inviting him into government. Almost none of these people were trying to cause a second world war. Each decision, in its own moment, had a defensible logic. It's only when you trace the full chain, the printing press, the loan, the crash, the withdrawal, the vote, the backroom deal, that you see how directly one produced the next. That is the real origin of World War II, or at least the part of it that almost never makes it past a single sentence in a textbook. The Depression contributed to the rise of fascism. That sentence is true. It's also doing an enormous amount of hidden work, compressing a specific, traceable, decade-long chain of financial decisions. A banker who wouldn't stop printing, loans that propped up a false recovery, and a market crash 6,000 miles away that pulled the floor out from under a country already once broken, into 6 words that make the whole thing sound almost inevitable. It wasn't inevitable. It was built, one decision at a time, by people who mostly believed they were solving a problem, right up until the moment their solutions became the next crisis. If this changed the way you think about how history's biggest catastrophes actually get built, not through single dramatic moments, but through long chains of smaller decisions most people never learn about, That's exactly what this channel exists to dig into. Sticking around and subscribing genuinely helps more people find this kind of history instead of the same 6-word textbook summary everyone else repeats. I'd love to know. Drop a comment and tell me what state you're texting from right now. I read every one, and I'm always curious how far this actually reaches. And here's what I want your take on. Out of everything in this video, what do you think mattered more in Hitler's rise to power? The 1923 hyperinflation that broke the public's trust in money itself, or the 1929 crash that pulled American loans out from under the recovery? Let me know below. I'll see you in the next one.